Vernon Henderson graduated from the University of British Columbia in 1968 with a degree in economics and went on to complete his PhD at the University of Chicago in 1972 with a dissertation entitled The Sizes and Types of Cities. Although he returned briefly to Canada to teach, by 1974 he had joined the faculty of Brown University's Economics Department, where he remained for almost 40 years, becoming the chair of the Urban Studies program in 1986, the Eastman Professor of Political Economy in 1994, and the chair of the Economics Department in 1995. Shortly after publishing this article in 2003, Henderson spent a year as a visiting professor at the London School of Economics, and then 10 years later gave up his positions at Brown University and moved to LSE full-time, where he now continues his urban research work. This article develops the suggestion of Wheaton and Shishido in greater detail and precision, leading Henderson to conclude that in fact he can identify an optimum size distribution for cities and countries at different levels of economic development, and that, as earlier researchers suspected, this optimum distribution changes over time in a nonlinear way as development proceeds. Henderson notes that many developing countries try to prevent what they see as a problem of primacy or dominance of one huge city at the expense of others. They adopt special programs and regulations encouraging the development and growth of other cities in the country. Why do some governments decide that they need to try such manipulation of what they often call the urban hierarchy of cities? After all, more than 30 years ago, Wheaton and Shishido found support for Williamson's idea that there may be a natural cycle built into the economic development process, first of concentration of jobs, money, and people in only one or a few key cities, and then a reversal and gradual dispersion out across a wide range of cities. If this occurs as a natural part of the development process, it might seem like governments should allow urban concentration to ebb and flow spontaneously in response to changing market forces that lead firms to balance these competing considerations. As Henderson says, anti-urban primacy policies respond to a perception that over-concentration and primacy are in fact distorting this natural development process, encouraged by specific political decisions such as favoritism toward a national capital or other large city sponsored by the elites who live there. This favoritism can appear as special public services like universities, hospitals, and other institutions available in such cities, or as legal restrictions on where capital can be invested, on where goods can be produced, imported, or exported, and even, as in countries like China, where people can legally go and live. Particularly when political and economic power are combined and restricted to a fairly small elite, this kind of favoritism toward one city at the expense of others may distort the supposedly natural trend of concentration and then deconcentration of urban population. Such distortions may even slow down economic growth and cause all kinds of other social problems. So Henderson sets himself two tasks for this article. First, he wants to know whether urbanization and urban distribution actually do follow some kind of natural optimum cycle as part of the process of economic development, and if so, what that path looks like. Second, he wants to know whether deviations from that optimum path really do cause economic problems for a country in terms of slowing down growth and development. This possible effect of primacy on growth is the so what question of his title. Most interested in the distribution of the urban population more than the absolute level of urbanization, and as it turns out in his results, this distribution seems to be what really matters for the efficiency of the development process, at least for the second half of the 20th century, between 1960 and 1995. One of the most interesting aspects of this study is that although Henderson discusses both the H-index used by Wheaton and Shishido and another measure of city size distribution called the Pareto parameter, he doesn't actually use either one of these detailed measures, for the simple reason that he can't find enough information about the distribution of all the cities in enough different countries. Like other researchers, he has to choose between including many countries in his analysis and measuring all the details of the urban distribution within a country. Wheaton and Shishido chose the detailed distribution measure 1 over H, so they could only study between 30 and 40 countries, and they never really told us what years they were studying. Henderson is able to double the number of countries to about 70, and he covers a 35-year period during which we can get a good look at the development process over time. To do this, he has to give up some of the detail in measuring city distributions. 1/h measure or some similar complex calculation, he falls back on the good old primacy index, simply looking at the share of the largest city in the total urban population of a country. This by saying that since the calculation of the H-index squares the proportion that each city has of the total urban population, and then sums all those squared terms, this measure is actually dominated by the proportionate size of the largest city. Squared proportions for smaller cities become vanishingly small and have little effect on the index result. So his measure of urban concentration is simply the share of the largest city in the total urban population of each country. To explain variations in this share over time, and from one country to another, he starts from predictions very similar to those of Wheaton and Shishido 30 years earlier. At first, it may make sense to concentrate capital in one city, to take advantage of economies of scale and supply connections between firms located close together. Then, past some tipping point, firms began to disperse out to other cities, partly to get closer to their markets, but also, as Henderson adds, because real estate and other costs in the one big city may have gotten so high that the smaller cities actually become more efficient and profitable by comparison. His so what question, Henderson must find a model of how various factors are related to economic growth. He gives us a basic economic model on his page 51, in which Y stands for income, or in this case, GNP per worker. This term on the left side of his equation number 1 is how he measures a country's level of development. The higher the ratio of GNP to workers, the higher he judges the efficiency and development of the country to be. He believes that this gross national product per capita outcome depends on 3 factors of production. Measures the capital stock in the country, and more capital makes each worker more efficient and productive. N measures the number of workers. Dividing GNP by this number of workers, as in all his formulas in the text, gives us the total output per worker. Finally, A represents the productivity per worker beyond what is explained by the amount of capital available. At first, Henderson describes this productivity measure as depending on the level of technology in the country. But since he can't find a good way to measure technology directly, he decides to measure the level of education of the working population, and to explain this by saying more educated workers can use new technology and capital more effectively. He then fiddles around with this basic picture until it becomes so complicated that only a trained economist can follow all the terms and equations, but the basic idea remains clear. More capital and education per worker lead to more GNP, which is what he means by development. For all his countries across all the years considered, these 3 factors of capital stocks, number, and education level of workers combine, he multiplies them together in the model, to predict national GNP. Of course, individual countries will show variations from the average calculation of GNP predicted by these factors, but a statistical model gives him at least a best-fitting estimation of the model. He presents this model in his Table 1 on page 56. In all the models across the columns of this table, the first row showing the effect of the amount of capital per worker comes out as a strong, statistically significant predictor of GNP per worker. There is no question about this effect at the heart of any spiral of economic development, since part of that larger GNP turns into even more capital to reinforce the spiral. The education level of the labor force also emerges in some of the models, at least, as an important positive influence on GNP, but this effect is much smaller and sometimes not even statistically significant. Of course, we need to remember that he didn't really find a good measure of actual technological level, and that this education measure is just a substitute in the first place. That may be why it doesn't predict higher GNP very strongly. Results in his Table 1 show the average effect of capital and education across all these countries, but of course some countries had lower than expected GNP for their levels of capital and education, while others did better than expected. Even within any country, some 5-year time periods between 1960 and 1995 may have shown more or less growth in GNP than expected from the capital available and the educational level of workers at the beginning of each period. Henderson is hoping that his primacy measure will show a statistical connection to this unexplained variability in GNP growth, so he expands his model to include 2 additional terms for this measure. There are 2 of these primacy terms in his equations 3, 4, and 5. If he had only 1 term for primacy, and it turned out to have a negative relation to GNP growth, as expected by those who worry about primacy as a problem, this result would mean that less urban concentration is always better for an economy, not only at the extreme of a primate city. The predicted ideal situation would always be total dispersion of the urban population across equal-sized cities, which Henderson recognizes is not the right way to measure such an effect. The second term, which multiplies the primacy measure times itself, primacy squared, makes the relation between primacy and optimum growth a quadratic curve. This means that too much primacy can slow down GNP growth, such as when the one huge city gets too crowded and expensive for efficient production, but also that too much dispersion into small cities can also slow down growth. Henderson explains this effect by saying that the biggest cities are usually where innovations in production, marketing, and technology emerge and are tested. Without a big city to take care of this innovation, less of it will happen, and the economy won't grow as fast. With this quadratic model, including 2 terms for primacy and its effects, he hopes to explain more of the variations in rates of economic growth than he was able to capture with just his basic 3-factor model by itself. If he does this, it will mean that primacy did have a separate effect on development. If both terms for primacy are statistically significant, he will even be able to identify the ideal balance for the size distribution of cities in a country. Since Henderson knows all about the earlier findings of Wheaton and Shishido and other researchers, he also knows better than to look for just one fixed, timeless answer to this question about the ideal level of primacy for the maximum growth rate of GNP in a country. Evidence from these previous studies that this optimum urban distribution may change over the development cycle, first toward more concentration and then eventually towards less and less concentration at higher starting levels of GNP per capita. So he could never get away with ignoring these findings and not including such a possibility in his model. To take account of a possible shifting ideal level of urban concentration, he adds yet another term to his model. He multiplies the primacy index times the level of development, measured as GNP per worker. This allows his model to find the same kind of nonlinear pattern suggested by Wheaton and Shishido if it fits the data for all his countries and time periods. Table 2 on his page 58 gives the results from testing his full model with primacy included against the experiences of countries around the world between 1960 and 1995. Comparing Table 2 to the earlier Table 1, you might notice that he loses about 10 of his 80 original countries this time around because he couldn't get the additional information he needed to include all of them in the full test. As before, by far the most important factor predicting GNP growth again turns out to be the amount of available capital per worker. Both these tables confirm the old saying that the rich get richer, and this time it applies to countries compared to each other. A more educated workforce also appears again in most of these columns as a weaker secondary boost to economic growth rates. Primacy measures, one plane and one squared, both show up in his results as statistically significant. This means that they do explain an important part of differences in GNP growth rates that are not explained by capital levels or education of workers. The 2 measures have opposite signs, which is what produces a curve that bends in the same direction at both ends instead of forming a straight line or a curve that only accelerates or decelerates in one direction. It confirms Henderson's expectation that there can be too little as well as too much urban concentration when it comes to maximum rates of GNP growth. If he does find this effect, he is able to see exactly where the resulting curve reaches its high point of efficiency. For example, he estimates that for a country with about 20 million people, in the mid-range of development levels at about $3,000 of GNP per worker, the optimal primacy score is about 0.4. The city should include about 40% of the urban population of that country. Either more or less, Henderson suggests, would predict slower increase in GNP per capita over the next 5-year period. Of course, with a bigger country in terms of either territory or population or both, the optimal level of primacy would be much lower, since it also depends on these features of a country that he calls scale factors, as shown in the additional measures appearing in his Table 3 on page 59. Finally, when he examines the results for the element of his model that looks at changes in this optimum with development level, he finds that in general, as countries get more developed and reach higher levels of GNP per capita, the ideal amount of urban concentration decreases, so countries have to spread out their urban population more evenly over more cities in order to keep growing at the maximum rate. Henderson's figure 1 on his page 60 shows this decline in the ideal level of urban concentration as development level increases. He presents two different results, one for a country with a smaller area and population, which he estimates should be more concentrated in the largest city, and another for a country with a larger area and population, which should be more spread out in general, but which also should have less primacy over time as development goes forward. There is no trace in this figure 1 of the bending curve observed by Wheaton and Shishido in their data 30 years earlier. Henderson comments on this difference, observing what he calls best primacy declines linearly with output per worker, which is his measure of development level. If we look carefully at his equations or his factors listed in these tables, though, we can see why he doesn't find any such curve with increasing urban concentration at the earliest stages of development. Wheaton and Shishido allowed for this effect by including the GNP per capita measure twice in their model, once by itself and once as an exponential term. These two terms made it possible for their model to capture any curvature of the optimum path that existed in their data. While Henderson allows for this nonlinear effect in primacy itself so that he can detect too little as well as too much urban concentration, he does not allow for any such nonlinear effect in the way primacy interacts with changing GNP per capita. There's only one term interacting primacy with GNP per capita, and it is a linear term. So of course his model can only produce linear effects, like those shown in his figure 1. If he really wanted to capture any possible nonlinear curve, like that identified by Wheaton and Shishido, his model would have needed a second interaction term, possibly multiplying primacy times GNP per capita squared, or an exponential term like that used by Wheaton and Shishido. So we can't be sure that there is no such temporary concentration advantage early in the development process, because Henderson never actually looks for it with this model. But his main conclusions are still quite clear and useful. First, we know that because there's evidence of slower growth for both too little or too much urban concentration, it is possible to find the optimal level of primacy for any point in the process of economic development. We also know that for most of this development process, that optimal level of primacy tends to fall lower and lower as internal markets expand. We also get an answer to his second question, the so what question about how big a penalty a country actually pays for straying off the track of this optimal level of urban concentration. The fact that there is such an optimum might not mean much after all if the growth penalty for too much or too little urban concentration turned out to be tiny and insignificant. But Henderson concludes that deviations from best primacy are very costly, on the order of 0.5 percentage point of growth per year for a country that is one standard deviation above or below the primacy value it should have for its current level of development. Since economies only grow a few percentage points per year, losing 0.5 point of growth every year will have a serious compound effect over time. He puts it, quote, "These losses are very large. They should answer the so what question, indicating that urban concentration is an important issue in the growth process," unquote.